Hello, Whitby Ben here with another weekend project. This is our John Deere JE75 self-propelled mower. The drive mechanism decided to quit working on it this weekend, so this weekend's project will be to replace the drive belt connecting the transmission to the main crankshaft on this mower. We're going to start by turning the fuel switch to the off position. Now we're going to disconnect the spark plug. And we're actually going to remove the spark plug. This uses a standard 13/16 inch spark plug wrench. Now we'll remove the door covering the drive belt. Just undo this knob here. Push down on the top and lift up. Going to use a 1/2 inch wrench to loosen the nuts on the control cables here, because we're going to want to adjust those after we replace the belt. So we'll be able to adjust that one. This is the blade clutch control belt here, and we're going to actually want to disconnect this cable entirely because we need to get the blade clutch out. So we'll disconnect that. We'll just tuck that in there so it doesn't get lost. To change the belt, we're going to have to pull the pulley off the drive shaft to the transmission. To do that, we're going to need a 17mm socket. I'm using a little electric hammer drill. And don't throw away the old belt. You're going to need the old belt to secure the pulley so that it doesn't rotate. You take a pair of vice grips here. Clamp this near the pulley. This will keep the pulley from rotating. We'll put the driver in place. And that allows us to loosen up the nut. If you try this without securing the pulley will just spin. So you save the old broken drive belt to stop the pulley from rotating. Now we should be able to pull the pulley off. Then we can put the new belt on. We'll thread this new belt through the body here. Alright, so there's a key down here that we need to align with the pulley. If you have the key aligned, the pulley will drop down on it. There we go. And we'll use the same trick to tighten up that nut. But I'm going to be a little bit more gentle with the drive belt here. Maybe I'll just hold it with my hand here. Okay, now we can go back underneath. The mower is now flipped up on its starboard side. The carburetor is on the top side of the mower with this orientation. Alright, we can now use a 16mm socket to remove the blade from the blade holder here. Takes a little bit of torque to break those bolts loose. And it is really important to make sure that spark plug has been disconnected to prevent the mower from unintentionally starting on you while you're working on anything along the drivetrain here. This is the blade clutch assembly, and unfortunately on this mower, in order to replace the drive belt, the blade clutch assembly has to be removed. And this can be kind of tricky. I've sprayed some liquid wrench around here, and this takes an 8mm Allen wrench, but it spins with the engine shaft. So in order to break this loose, we have to stop the engine shaft from rotating. You can try removing the recoil starter by taking these acorn nuts off and then using a breaker bar and a large socket on a nut that's mounted on the top of the crankshaft. That when I had tried that, it just loosened that nut and didn't stop the crankshaft from rotating. So a more surefire solution to that is to preventing the piston from, or the crankshaft from rotating, is to take a rope, or in this case I'm just going to use the broken fan belt, the broken drive belt, and stuff it into that hole, into the spark plug hole. So with my left hand, I'm going to push the drive belt remnant into the spark plug hole while I rotate the piston here. And you want to basically, I'm stuffing the drive belt in. You want to fill the piston chamber with that. Drive belt so it will jam up the piston. So I think I've gotten about 6 or 8 inches into there. Then I'm going to turn this until it stops rotating, which means that it's jammed up in there, okay? Now you might want to use a 8mm Allen attachment for a hammer drill if you've got one, or just be real careful that you apply the torque so that you don't strip out the threads here. It's going to take quite a bit of torque, but there it goes. Now we can back this out. Not only are we working against the piston, but there's also a compression spring here for the clutch assembly. Alright, so we've got that out of there. The lower clutch plate just slips right off just like that. And now we have to remove the rest of this assembly here. There's some tension applied by a spring here, which we'll need to release. This is an 8mm socket. There's a bar here that holds the spring tension on, so I'm going to loosen this up. Take that bolt out, and I'm just going to loosen this one enough so that the spring arm can be moved and you can actually take the spring off of that. Okay, this takes a lot of the force off of this. So I'll take this post out. So that uses a 19mm socket. This allows this to come free. And now we're going to have to loosen the motor mounting bolts. There's 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, in order to get clearance to get this blade clutch control arm out from under the body here. These are 15mm bolts that hold the motor to the body of the mower. We're going to back these bolts out about 1/2 inch, and we're going to take the top ones out entirely. That will give us enough room to get this control arm assembly out. The motor will start to tilt down when you remove the last bolt, so I reach around over the top and support the motor with my other hand. See how the motor moves like that? So now, while supporting the motor with the other hand, actually, I'm going to put this bolt back in for right now, just to put one of the bolts in partially just to support this in a location where there's no, this is partly supporting that, so this is still free and it's not binding anything, but we need to slide this off of the crankshaft. And there's a trick to getting this off. What you need is an M14 coarse threaded bolt. That's a metric M14 coarse threaded bolt. That will actually thread into here. This particular bolt has a 22mm diameter, or a 22mm size. Now we're going to drive this bolt forward, but we're going to have to watch very carefully to make sure that we don't bend any of these clutch components here to get this upper clutch plate out. So as this bolt goes forward, you see this is all still, it's sliding out on the drive shaft. You don't want to bend these things, so as we get closer to the frame here, now I can loosen this up and drop the motor out a little bit further. We'll keep advancing this up and dropping the motor until we can actually get the clutch plate off. There we go. Look at that. So that's how we get that out of there. Okay, we slipped the belt in from above. Now we just need to get it around the pulley here. And now we can reverse the disassembly process. When you reassemble the clutch mechanism, this spring has to be above the crankshaft, and so it needs to be oriented like this when you slip this on. Also, there is a keyway in the crankshaft that has to be aligned with the keyway that's on the upper clutch plate here. We'll go ahead and take this bolt out, and when we reassemble, it'll be hard to film, but I'm going to have to look through this hole here to see where that keyway is to get it all lined up and then jiggled back onto the shaft. To hold the spring in place, I'm going to use a rubber band. Alright, to keep this spring oriented above the drive shaft here, I'm going to take a rubber band, slip it over the spring here, and then just over the clutch like that, just to hold it in orientation. And I'm going to check to see where the keyway is, to line it up with where it is on the crankshaft here. Now this has to go over the top of the body, and this has to fit under the body. And it's going to be difficult to film because I'm going to reach around over the top with my other hand to rock the motor back and forth to get the angle we need. This is the control cable on top. It's kind of in the way, so I'm just going to move it out of the way. Alright, so I can pivot the motor with my left hand while I'm working with this on the right hand, aligning the keyway with the key and slipping this back down onto the drive shaft here. Alright, once you have the keyway aligned, then you can slide this down. I'm going to use one of the motor mount nuts here to support the motor so I don't have to hold it with my left hand the whole time. And now we're going to just kind of walk this down. Making sure that we don't bend any of these components on the frame here. I'm using this nut to pull the motor back up. And at this point we can probably tighten up these lower bolts now. We'll go back to the 15mm socket. Keeping an eye on here to make sure that we don't bend this by binding it on anything. We're not going to go all the way tight on that just yet. Now that the upper clutch assembly is back on the drive shaft here, we can tighten up the engine mounting bolts. It's going to be real important to do this one here before you do this one here, because this will obstruct access to that bolt. So we'll put that bolt in there. Use our 15mm socket here to tighten that up. And we'll tighten up all the rest of them. And I just like to check the torque with torque these manually here. Make sure they're tightened up and not too tight. Now we can replace this bolt here, or this pin. And that's on a 19. Now we're going to reattach the spring here, which will put all this under tension here. So rubber band comes off. I'm going to push this arm out, tuck the spring under it. And now to put tension on the spring, I'm going to use a really big screwdriver between this mounting point here. that to align the hole here so I can get this bolt back in. Okay, with that centered there, I'm going to use this to tighten it back up. Manually torque these. We'll put the lower clutch plate assembly on here. Put this bolt back in here. Now, since we're going to be rotating the motor the opposite direction, the piston may move a little bit. But because that old broken belt is still in there, it will stop the piston rotation eventually. If not, you may have to stuff a little bit more drive belt into the hole while you're cranking it around, and that will stop the motor from rotating. And we want this nice and tight, but we don't want to end up with the same problem we had last time with it being too tight. Now, that's tight actually, but I'm using this now to move the piston up and down, and I'm going to pull that drive belt out of the piston, out of the piston here. So that's the old drive belt. I just pulled it all out, and now that spins freely. Okay, now we're going to put a freshly sharpened blade back on here. $16mm socket for these. Okay, we flip the mower back over. We're going to reinstall the spark plug. And turn the fuel back on here. We'll check our control cables here. A little bit of slack here. Tighten that back up. We need to reconnect our clutch here. Alright, so we're going to reconnect our blade brake there. Tighten this back up here. Yeah, we're going to check for proper play on that. So that looks okay. And finally, we're going to replace our cover here. Put this little retainer knob back on here. Well, that wraps up another weekend project. We've got the drive belt replaced on our JE75. I hope you found the video useful. If you did, please subscribe. Until our next project, bye-bye. I'm just going to jiggle things back and forth here so I can get this back on the drive shaft. Now once that's on, I can use one of the motor bolts here to hold the motor up. Keep that from falling. Okay. Now the spring is crossing where it needs to cross, so we can remove the rubber band. Let's line up this bolt here and secure this. Actually, we're probably going to have to put the motor bolt in first. Going to leave this off to the side. We'll put the motor bolt in. I'm going to tighten the motor bolts just a little bit here. We still want to make sure this can move freely here, but I don't want the motor to be too far away from the chassis here. So we still have free motion there.